She was 22 and had buried her father in the rain 6 weeks before, in the small Lutheran cemetery on the hill above the river, with 7 people present and no one there who knew his trade. No apartment, no savings, no plan, just a small brass clock key on a tarnished steel chain around her neck and $43 she had earned waiting tables at the truck stop diner on Route 6. And with that $43, she paid the back taxes on a condemned clock tower at the bend of Black Brook Road in the village of Hadley Forge, Litchfield County, Connecticut, in a stretch of low hills and dairy ground that had not heard a tower bell ring the hour since the autumn of 1968. The roof slates were green with creeping moss. The hour hand of the south face hung crooked at 4 past, as if the tower itself had stopped breathing on the very afternoon her father had been born. But what nobody knew, not the lawyer who had laughed quietly when her siblings laughed, not the bank that had foreclosed on her father's house the week of the funeral, not even the old men at the feed store who still remembered the family name, was that hidden behind the clock face of that tower, inside a brass-lined chamber her father had sealed shut with his own hands the winter before he died, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had grown up with the smell of clock oil and brass polish, and the dry, sweet dust that gathers inside a wooden case that has not been opened in 50 years. She had grown up to the sound of pendulums in conversation with each other, of escapements ticking out of unison and slowly drawing back into time, of small bronze hammers striking small bronze bells in the late afternoon light of her father's back-room shop on Pearl Street. There were 17 clocks running in that shop on any given day, and she could name each of them by the sound of its movement alone, the way another child might know the voices of cousins. The Vienna regulator on the north wall, with its quick light tick. The Seth Thomas in the corner, slow and patient like an old dog. The brass skeleton clock under the bell jar on her father's desk, which her great-grandfather had carried across the Atlantic in a wicker basket in the autumn of 1893. Her father wore a leather apron stained dark at the chest where the case oils had soaked in over the years, and a watchmaker's loop on a black cord around his neck, and his hands, when he worked, moved with the slow exactness of a man who had been taught by his own father, who had been taught by his own grandfather, who had crossed an ocean to bring this trade to this small Connecticut town and to build, with his own 2 hands and with the help of 2 stonemasons from Torrington, the tower on Black Brook Road that now stood condemned and crooked at 4 past in the November cold. The shop on Pearl Street had 3 small windows that looked east into the side yard of the Lutheran church, and the morning light came through them at a slant from October through March, and a slant the other way from April through September, and her father said that he could tell the season from where the light fell on the green felt of his bench, the way other men told the season from the leaves. He kept a small wood stove in the corner that he lit every morning at 6 and damped down at 5, and on the top of the stove he kept a tin coffee pot that smelled of chicory and of the hard-pressed water of the western Connecticut hills, and the smell of the coffee and the smell of the stove and the smell of the clock oil were the 3 smells of her childhood. In that order, the smell of clock oil, she would later say, was the first smell she could remember, before bread, before wood smoke, before the meadowsweet that grew along the brook in June. The oil came first, because the oil had been there before she was. His name was Anselm Becker, and he had crossed from the canton of Schaffhausen in the autumn of 1893 on a North German Lloyd steamer that took 11 days and that carried in its hold, among the trunks and the crates and the bundles of cheap rope, 1 wicker basket lined with oiled wool, inside of which lay 7 brass clock movements wrapped in clean linen, 4 sets of bench tools rolled in soft leather, a small leather notebook in his own hand, and a sealed letter that he did not open and that no one would open for 131 years. He was 26 when he came, and he had buried his own father in Schaffhausen the year before, and he had brought with him nothing of his old life except the trade and the tools and the notebook, because the trade and the tools and the notebook were, he believed, the only inheritance a man could carry that no border guard could take from him. He came up the Hudson by steamboat and across into Connecticut by rail, and he settled in the early spring of 1894 in the small dairy village of Hadley Forge, because the village had a brook with steady water for his cutting wheel, and a forge with a German-speaking smith who would mill brass for him at fair rates, and a Lutheran church whose pastor agreed to let him repair the church's stopped clock in exchange for a winter of board and 1 meal a day at the parsonage. He repaired that clock in 17 days. He repaired 3 more clocks in the following month, and 7 more in the month after that, and by the late autumn of 1894 he had earned enough to rent a single room above the dry goods store on Pearl Street, and to set up his first bench beneath its single small window. By 1898, 4 years after his arrival, he had a small shop on Pearl Street with his name lettered on the window in gold paint, Becker Horology and Repair, and by 1901, he had bought a half-acre hayfield at the bend of Black Brook Road for $90 and had begun to build, by hand and with the help of 2 stonemasons from Torrington, a brick clock tower 38 feet high, with 2 clock faces of pressed copper, a swinging pendulum of his own design, and a single bronze bell cast in Hartford to his own specifications. He worked on that tower every Sunday for 4 years. He laid the bricks himself, with a small German hod and a wooden trowel his own father had given him before the steamer sailed. And he turned the wheels of the great brass movement himself on a foot-powered Swiss lathe he had carried up from Hartford on a wagon in the spring of 1902. And he hauled the bronze bell up the inside of the shaft on a block and tackle of his own rigging, with the 2 stonemasons holding the rope and his pastor reading aloud from the Book of Psalms for steadiness. The tower took every dollar he had earned in 8 years of repair work, and it took every Sunday from his 34th year to his 38th. And on the last Sunday before he hung the hands, he climbed alone to the platform inside the bell housing, and he stood there for an hour without moving, looking out across the dairy ground toward the small Lutheran church where he had repaired his first American clock, and the small house on Pearl Street, where he would, in the following year, marry a Connecticut woman named Marta Schiller and begin the line that would, 3 generations later, lead down through the long quiet years to a 22-year-old girl standing at the foot of the rise on a cold November afternoon with $43 to her name. He finished the tower in October of 1905, and on the first Sunday of that month, at 3 in the afternoon, the bell of the tower at Hadley Forge rang for the first time, and it rang every hour, on the hour, without missing a single stroke, for the next 63 years. Anselm Becker died in the winter of 1941, with his hand still on the bench and the green-shaded lamp still burning, and the trade passed to his son, Carl, and from Carl to her father Henry, and from Henry, in the long, slow, patient way of these things, down to her. Her father Henry began teaching her the trade when she was 6 years old. He set her on a tall wooden stool in front of the workbench, and he tied a small canvas apron around her waist that he had cut down from one of his own, and he gave her a single mainspring barrel from a broken parlor clock and a pair of brass tweezers, and he said, in his soft and patient voice, "Look at this barrel, and tell me 3 things you see. And do not touch it until you have looked for a full minute." She looked for a full minute. She told him 3 things she saw. He nodded. He gave her another barrel. By 8, she could disassemble and reassemble the movement of a standard American shelf clock without dropping a screw or losing a wheel. and she could name each of the 11 principal parts in English and in the Old German that her great-grandfather had used, because her father had never bothered to translate them. By 12, she could rebuild the escapement of a regulator without consulting any book, and she could hear, with her eyes closed, the difference between a clock running half a beat fast and a clock running true. By 15, she could grade pivots, turn wheel teeth on the small Swiss lathe in the corner of the shop, and replace the suspension spring of a French portico clock without bending a single coil. She remembered, from that 15th year, a single afternoon in the late September of it, when an old man from the hill country brought down a Black Forest cuckoo clock that had not run in 41 years. Her father set the clock on the bench and stepped back and folded his arms and told her to find what was wrong with it. She worked on that clock for the whole afternoon, while her father read at the roll-top desk and the wood stove ticked and the slanted October light came through the east windows. She found the broken pin in the count wheel just before dusk. She did not say a word. She set the pin. She wound the clock. The cuckoo came out and called the hour 6 times in its small carved voice. Her father did not look up from his book, but he smiled, in the same quiet way he had smiled at her first 3 things you see when she was 6. By 18, she could repair anything that ticked, and she had, in the small steel case her father kept locked in the roll-top desk, her own set of bench tools with her own initials stamped into the brass handles by the German-speaking smith's grandson, who still worked the forge at the end of Pearl Street. She did not go to college, because she did not need to. The trade was the inheritance, and the inheritance was older than any school in the state of Connecticut. She worked at the bench beside her father every afternoon after high school, and every Saturday from breakfast to dusk, and every summer from the day school let out until the day it took her back, and in those long warm afternoons the 17 clocks of the backroom shop on Pearl Street ticked around the 2 of them like a slow choir, and she did not yet know that this was the happiest she would ever be. Her father taught her 3 rules, and he taught them on 3 separate days, and he never wrote any of them down. The first rule he taught her in the spring of her 7th year, on a Saturday morning in March, while the brook outside ran high with thaw water. He took her hand, and he placed it on the winding key of the Vienna regulator, and he said, "Wind from the same hand each time." "The clock will know," he said. "A clock that is wound from the right hand on Monday and from the left hand on Tuesday will lose itself within a month. Pick a hand," he said. "Pick it once. Use it for the rest of your life." The second rule he taught her in the autumn of her 11th year, on a cold October afternoon in the back room of the shop, with the wood stove ticking beside them. He laid a broken pocket watch on the green felt of the bench, and he covered her eyes with his hand. And he said, "Listen before you look. Half of what is wrong with a clock will tell itself to you in the first 10 seconds, he said, if you have the patience to be still and to hear it. The other half will hide from you until you stop trying to see it. Listen first. Look second. Never the other way around." The third rule he taught her in the winter of her 15th year, when she was hurrying a repair on a school night and had begun to press a click spring into a wheel that was a quarter turn out of true. He took the tool from her hand. He set it down on the bench. He looked at her over the loop, and he said, "Never force a part that was made to fit. If it does not fit," he said, "it is because you have not yet understood what it is. Go and understand it. Then come back. The clock will wait. The clock has waited longer than you have been alive." 3 rules. Wind from the same hand. Listen before you look. Never force a part that was made to fit. She would carry those 3 rules for the rest of her life. Her father got sick in the August of her 18th year. He told her on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of weak tea between his hands, that the doctor at the clinic in Torrington had found a shadow on the upper lobe of his left lung. He said the word shadow without flinching, the way a clockmaker says the word flaw. He told her she should not worry. He told her he would beat it. He told her, with a small tired smile, that he had a few more clocks left to wind. He worked at the bench for nearly 4 years after that diagnosis, and then one May, when she was almost 22, he could not work at the bench anymore. And she ran the shop alone through that summer and that autumn, while he sat in the wooden chair by the window with a wool blanket over his knees and corrected her with a quiet patience that broke her every afternoon when she went home. He died on a Sunday in October, just after the first frost, with his hand on the winding key of the Vienna regulator. She was holding his other hand. She did not cry. She wound the regulator from the right hand as he had taught her, and she set the time by the standard clock on the wall, and she went into the back room, and she sat down on the wooden stool he had given her when she was 6, and she stayed there until the last of the slanted October light had left the east windows of the shop. The funeral was small. 7 people. Her sister did not come down from Boston. Her brother came for one afternoon and left before the casket was closed. The bank took the house within a month because the medical bills had not been paid in nearly 2 years, and her father had refused in his quiet, stubborn way to put the shop up as collateral against the loan. The landlord took her apartment 2 weeks after that, because she could not work the bench and grieve at the same time, and the shop did not earn enough alone. The Pearl Street shop closed in late November when the lease ran out, and she packed the 17 clocks one by one into wooden crates lined with old newspaper. And she watched the truck from the storage company drive them away down Pearl Street at 4 in the afternoon on a day she would not, for the rest of her life, be able to remember the exact date of. She moved into the spare room above the truck stop diner on Route 6, and she waited tables for tips, and she put the small brass clock key around her neck on the tarnished steel chain, and she did not take it off. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small ticking thing in your family that someone tended for years on end that you carry with you from a person who is no longer here? The lawyer read the will out loud in the cramped office above the hardware store on Main Street. When he got to her name, her siblings actually laughed. There was the house, which the bank already had. There were 2 small accounts, which went to her brother. And there was, written in her father's neat black script on a single sheet of yellow legal paper, the brick clock tower on Blackbrook Road, left in its entirety to his youngest daughter with all back taxes due. She paid the back taxes the following Friday at the county courthouse in Litchfield with the $43 she had folded inside the small steel clock key on the chain. The clerk was a man named Earl Hennessy, and when she said her name, he went very still. "Becker," he said softly. "Henry Becker's girl." She nodded. He turned and walked into the records room behind the counter and came back a moment later with a small iron key on a length of green twine. "Been in the safe 41 years, he said. "Your grandfather's." He left instructions it was to be given to whoever paid the taxes on the tower. "The tower has been waiting." He laid his hand briefly on her shoulder as she turned to go. She drove out to Blackbrook Road that same afternoon in the rusted Ford pickup that had been her father's, with the heater running and a thermos of weak coffee on the seat beside her and the small iron key on its green twine wound around her left wrist. Blackbrook Road was a 2-lane blacktop that ran north out of Hadley Forge between Low Hills and Dairy Ground. Past the old Goss farm and the burned-out foundation of the Methodist parsonage, past a stand of black walnut trees that had been planted, her father had once told her, The same year the tower had been finished, and at the second bend, where the brook ran close to the road and the willows leaned in low over the water, the tower stood on a rise of dry brown grass. She had not seen it in 11 years. It was smaller than she remembered. The brick was the color of dried blood where the rain had not weathered it, and the color of bone where it had. The two copper clock faces had gone green, the slow patient green of a pond in summer, and the south hour hand hung crooked at 4 past, as she had seen it from the road every day of her childhood, without ever truly seeing it. A single line of starlings sat along the louver of the bell housing. The grass at the base of the tower had been left uncut for so many summers that it had gone to seed and bowed under its own weight. She stood at the foot of the rise for a long minute. She did not cry. She watched a single crow lift off the bell housing and bank east over the brook. Then she walked up the rise through the cold, dry grass, and she stood at the iron door at the base of the tower, and she fitted the small iron key into the lock. The lock turned on the first try, as if it had been oiled the week before. The door swung in on its old hinges. The smell that came out was the smell of clock oil and brass polish and the dry, sweet dust that gathers inside a wooden case that has not been opened in 50 years. She stepped inside. The inside of the tower was a single round chamber 38 feet high, with a narrow oak staircase spiraling up the inner wall, and a wooden platform at the top where the great movement of the clock had once turned the hands of the two copper faces. The light came down in long, dusty shafts through the gaps in the louvers of the bell housing, and the bronze bell hung silent in the half-dark above. She climbed the stairs slowly. She counted them as she went. 47 steps. Her great-grandfather had built them by hand from white oak cut on his own backlot, and her grandfather had walked them every Sunday for 40 years, and her father had walked them every Sunday until the summer of his 18th year, when he had left for the army and not come home to them for 4 long years. At the top of the stairs, on the wooden platform, the great brass movement of the tower clock stood under a layer of dust the color of pale wheat. The pendulum hung still at the end of its long rod. The going train, the strike train, the bronze count wheel, the cast-iron frame stamped Becker Hadley Forge, 1905 along its lower edge, all of it stood as still as the day, 58 years before, when the last keeper of the tower had locked the door behind himself and walked away down Blackbrook Road into the dusk. She did not touch the movement. She did not yet have the right to touch it. She stood beside it, and she looked at the back of the south clock face from the inside, and she saw, behind the copper sheet, what no one looking up from Blackbrook Road had ever been meant to see. There was a small brass-lined chamber set into the brick wall behind the clock face. It was the size of a steamer trunk laid on its side, fitted with a copper door that had been brazed shut at 4 corners by a careful and recent hand. On the door, scratched into the metal in a hand she knew at once, were 2 letters and a date. H.B. December, the winter before her father had died. She found a small file in the toolbox on the platform. She worked at the brazing for nearly an hour, with the cold November light coming down through the louvers and the wind moving softly in the bell housing above her head. The brazing gave at the 3rd corner with a small, dry sound. The door swung open on its tiny brass hinges. Inside the chamber, on a bed of oiled wool, lay a set of bench tools she had never seen before, stamped with the initials A. B, and dated 1893. There were calipers, pivot files, mainspring winders, a small Swiss balance staff lathe in miniature, a set of brass tweezers worn smooth by use, and a leather roll of bench pegs, each turned by hand on a wheel 130 years before in a workshop on the Rhine. Beside the tools lay a small leather-bound notebook in a hand older than her father's. written in pencil and in the old German that her great-grandfather had used, dated on its first page Schaffhausen, 1888, and on its last page Hadley Forge, December 1939. Beside the notebook lay a velvet-lined case, and inside the case lay 19 gold pocket watches of various sizes and makes, English fusee and Swiss lever, and one fine American railroad grade, each tagged with a small paper label tied with linen thread in her great-grandfather's hand, each label noting the year of repair and the original owner and the small private observation he had made about the movement. And on top of it all lay a sealed letter, addressed in old German script to one line of words that had waited 131 years to be read, to whoever finds this, when the tower is at last given back to its keeper. She sat down on the dusty oak platform. She did not cry. She broke the seal. She read it aloud, because some letters are meant to be read aloud, even when there is no one in the room to hear them but the dust and the pendulum and the long silence of a tower that has been waiting. To whoever finds this, when the tower is at last given back to its keeper. My name is Anselm Becker, and I was born in the canton of Schaffhausen in the year 1867, and I came to this country in the autumn of 1893 with 7 brass movements and 4 sets of bench tools and 1 wicker basket lined with oiled wool, and a notebook that I had begun to keep on the steamer and that I kept until the year of my death. I built this tower with my own 2 hands and with the hands of 2 stonemasons from Torrington in the years between 1901 and 1905. And I rang the bell for the first time on the first Sunday of October, 1905, at 3 in the afternoon. I tell you this not because I wish you to remember me, but because I wish you to know that the tower was built with patience, and that patience is the only thing in this trade that cannot be bought, and the only thing that cannot be lost. I have left here the tools of my bench and the tools of my own father's bench in Schaffhausen before me, and 19 gold watches that I repaired across a lifetime, which any honest watchmaker in the city of Hartford will tell you are of fair value. They are yours. Sell what you must, keep what you can, wind from the same hand, listen before you look, never force a part that was made to fit. The tower has waited for you. So has the trade. Anselm Becker, watchmaker, Hadley Forge, Connecticut, this 12th day of December, in the year of our Lord 1939. She carried the 19 gold pocket watches in the velvet-lined case down the 47 stairs, and she set them on the seat of the pickup, and she drove them to Hartford the following Wednesday, to a horologist named Frederick Werner, whose name she had found written in her father's notebook in a careful pencil hand. Frederick Werner was 81 years old and walked with a cane and wore green-tinted spectacles indoors. He looked at the watches for nearly 3 hours without speaking, lifting each one in turn under a green-shaded lamp, opening the cases, listening to the balances, comparing serial numbers against a ledger of his own that went back to the year 1962. He set the last watch down on the green felt. He took off his loupe. He looked at her over the rim of his spectacles, and he said, in a voice gone soft with the weight of the moment, $38,000, my dear, possibly 40. Your great-grandfather repaired these, and the work is the finest I have seen in this state in 40 years. She drove back to Hadley Forge in the late afternoon light with the velvet case on the seat beside her. She did not stop to celebrate. She did not call anyone. She drove past the truck-stop diner where she had waited tables, and past the small Lutheran cemetery on the hill where she had buried her father, and out along Blackbrook Road to the tower, and she climbed the 47 stairs to the wooden platform. And she took the soft chamois cloth from her father's old bench roll, and she began to clean the great brass movement. Slowly, surface by surface, the way she had been taught when she was 8 years old. She worked on the movement for 9 days. She cleaned every wheel, every pivot, every tooth of the bronze count wheel, and every coil of the long suspension spring. She oiled each jewel from her father's last bottle of clock oil, which she had carried in her coat pocket for 6 weeks without knowing what she would do with it. On the 9th evening, just before sundown, she wound the great brass movement from the right hand as she had been taught, and she set the pendulum swinging for the first time in 58 years. Word traveled the way word travels in a small town. The bell of the tower at Hadley Forge had rung once, on a Thursday at 5 in the afternoon, on a clear, cold November day with a low sun and a thin band of coral pink across the western hills. And old men in the feed store on Pearl Street had looked up from their coffee cups at the sound. And old women in the post office had set down their letters, and the bell had rung 6 times for the hour and then gone still, and within a week she had visitors. Earl Hennessy from the county courthouse drove out one Saturday morning in his old gray sedan and brought her a small tin of brass polish and a folded square of soft chamois cloth that had belonged to his uncle, who had been her great-grandfather's last apprentice in the year 1936. He set them on the bench inside the tower, and he stood for a moment looking up at the great brass movement above them, and he said, in a voice that was lower than she had ever heard from him at the courthouse counter, "Your uncle is buried beside mine, in the small Lutheran cemetery on the hill." He did not stay long. A woman named Margaret Albrecht, who had played the organ at the Lutheran church for 46 years, and who had, as a girl, sat in the second pew on the Sunday her father was christened, brought her a sealed glass jar of clock oil that her own father had pressed in 1958 from the seeds of a kind of safflower that no one in Connecticut had grown since the war, and a handwritten list of every clock in the village that had stopped working since 1968 and was, in her estimation, waiting to be wound again. She set the list on the bench. She took both of Hannah's hands in her own. She did not say anything. She left. They came in their ones and twos across the long late autumn weeks, the older townspeople who still remembered the bell, and they brought her what they could, and they asked nothing at all in return. That's the thing about the clocks our fathers teach us, and the towers our great-grandfathers build, and the small brass keys we wear on chains around our necks long after the hands that gave them to us have gone still. They are not heirlooms. Heirlooms are kept in cabinets. They are not antiques. Antiques are bought and sold. They are vigils. They are quiet, patient vigils that an earlier generation lit and tended and handed on, and that the next generation is asked, gently and without insistence, to keep tending, in their own hand, from their own bench, for as long as they are given. Wind from the same hand. Listen before you look. Never force a part that was made to fit. The trade is older than the school. The tower is older than the road. The bell has been waiting. So has the work. Her name was Hannah Becker. She was 22 years old. She had buried her father 6 weeks before, and she had nothing left in the world but a small brass key on a tarnished steel chain and $43 she had earned waiting tables at the truck stop diner on Route 6. She had $43 to her name, and she spent it on a condemned clock tower at the bend of Blackbrook Road. It was the best $43 she ever spent. If this story kept you company tonight, share it with someone who would love it, and we will see you in the last warm light of the day.